I considered calling this Lawyer's Critique 1.1 because it's a follow-up to the first video, but version numbers are kind of silly. It's a new video, so why not just call it the next one? First, who I am Ronald the Rules Lawyer. I am a lawyer and also an RPG teacher to middle school and high school students. I have as my preferred system Pathfinder 2nd edition, and I have also GM'd D&D 5th edition. And with Wizards of the Coast now working on its next edition, this is a great time to talk about how D&D can be great. And the quick version of what I hope it should do is to create a modular system that has as its core something that's simpler than 5th edition, which tables can choose to expand upon to give players more options to customize their characters and give DMs more tools to run their games easily. My first video reacted to the first document to come from 1D&D on character origins, and before I went into the document itself, I made two main points. One, that this is a new edition, and two, that this is not an actual playtest so far. Both points were united by a single sentiment. Because this is a new edition, nothing in D&D currently has to stay the same, and also, to be an actual playtest, the design team needs to be transparent with its design goals, which it isn't so far. And it appears that they've made some decisions already without the community's participation, and that players should do more than simply fill out Wizards of the Coast surveys. So this uniting sentiment is an argument for players advocating to Wizards of the Coast, which this series that I'm doing attempts to do. And a lot of, actually the vast majority of people responding to the video were very supportive. There are a lot of hears, but there are also some hostile comments, which I'll address later in the video. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate what an actual playtest looks like, but first I just want to add a couple more bits of evidence that this is going to be a new edition from my point from my previous video. First, Bob Worldbuilder, I thank for finding some language in the FAQ on Wizards' website showing, first, that they actually are not committing to a release date of 2024, thus reserving the right to go back to the drawing board more than they currently anticipate. And two, the language that they will be using, or they will be implementing, quote, fundamental updates, unquote, to D&D. And the word fundamental is an important word to use. Further, in their current public statements, they are only talking about the 5e adventures and supplements being compatible with the new set of books.
All the adventures and supplements that have been released in the past 10 years will still be playable with the new evolution of D&D.
Meaning 5th edition adventures and supplements will work in 1D&D.
This means that the current Player's Handbook, Monster's Manual, and Dungeon Master's Guide, there is zero claim of any compatibility or usefulness with the new set of books. And when you think about it, that is the meat of the entire system. The lie is still there, the effort to get people to buy current books that will be made obsolete, but it's more sophisticated. They are not currently saying that the Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, and Dungeon Master's Guide will be useful in the new era. What they're saying, well, the lie is in the name, the term supplements. Most people, when they hear supplements, especially in their current PR, when they're talking about replacing the 3 books only, will be thinking, oh, that's everything else afterward. Xanathar's Guide to Everything, Tasha's Guide to Everything, Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, all the setting books, Spelljammer, stuff like that. But in what world is the Player's Handbook entirely replaced and all of those books can be used with little effort? They still want people to buy the 5e current versions of all of those books, but when they put out a new version of a Hexblade Warlock or a Bladesinger Wizard, those in 6e, those versions are going to be compatible with the new edition and completely replace the current ones. And they maintain plausible deniability. They can say, well, we said that supplements would still be compatible, but we never said what supplements were exactly, did we? So this truly means that nothing is safe in the current version of D&D as we know it, and players should advocate for what they think should happen in the new edition, and that includes borrowing from the innovations from other systems. And if I may indulge myself a bit, I want to boast that I saw that this new edition was coming. Before the PDF came out, I had my video saying, drop the bullshit, this is a new edition. But I'd been anticipating this for months. The announcement came out last September from Wizards of the Coast that they'd be putting out new versions of the core books. And they also said that current books will be compatible with the new books. And everybody, the prevailing opinion was taking that at face value, that basically there would be very little change from 5e to whatever this was going to be called, and that they would just clean up the rules, maybe address a few balance issues, and call it a day. But what got the wheels turning in my head was a interview that I saw on Roll for Combat, which is a great channel that's focused on Pathfinder and also other tabletop role-playing games. And Mark Seifter, one of the co-designers of their company, talked about the history, what he saw from the history, studying the history of other editions of tabletop games. And he said that
here's generally how a game's edition cycle works. The truth of the matter is that whether or not it's compatible, that helps somewhat with bringing people over. And for a little while, people will use some of their stuff from the prior edition that was compatible in the new one. And maybe some people really hardcore and have a lot of really good stuff from the previous edition will keep doing it for even longer than that. But most people just won't. They'll think of it as still as a nice new stepping stone point where they can come in, be fresh, and just generally use little or none of the compatible material, even if it's very compatible.
So I was pretty convinced this was what Wizards of the Coast should do. It just seemed the most logical thing to do. First, from a pure sales and profit standpoint, you want everybody who you can get to buy the new books, including people who have the previous books, because they have to. You want to break compatibility a bit in order to increase the sales. But also, this was an opportunity because 5th edition was built from the ground up and was kind of a initial go at that design to fix some issues that they didn't have the opportunity to address the first time. And so feats, for example, were an optional variant system kind of tacked on without much consideration for balance. And this would be a chance to address that and also address some common complaints. And so I had this outline that I worked on starting in February for a video that I just got postponed over and over again. And then I'll show some proof that I had that. And then on March 30th, Jeremy Crawford, the lead designer for D&D, in an interview said that feats in the new player's handbook will have levels, and also that there will be feat stacking, that some feats will be required to take others. And that made me absolutely convinced that what people were thinking this was going to be was vastly underestimating how much they're going to actually revise. On whether this is a 5.5e or a 6e, I think the debate is silly. I think that we need to shed this idea that a new whole number edition requires a dramatic, almost shocking change compared to the previous edition. That's not true with every other TTRPG. In fact, it's only D&D that started this a few years ago when they named 3rd edition 3.5, which was a marketing move to avoid offending people too greatly who had just bought 3rd edition books 3 years prior. And every other tabletop role-playing game has more incremental revisions from edition to edition. And I have here my 7th edition copy of Call of Cthulhu, which is largely compatible with the very first edition. And we need to renormalize this idea that editions are healthy, that it is the designers of a system responding to the concerns and issues that come up in their system. There's a counter to my argument that they're just trying to preserve short-term sales, that they are trying to not get people to freak out about a new edition. And to which I would say, people will freak out regardless what you do. And in fact, they will freak out more if you are not transparent about your new edition, which will make people imagine the worst. And the way to address anxiety about a new edition coming is to be above board. Talk about your design goals. Talk about the issues with your current edition that you plan to address. That you'll be incorporating popular house rules, that you'll be trying out rules and subsystems to address those complaints. Basically, be in a dialogue with people. I would argue that the transition from 2E to 3E was one such transition, and from 3E to 3.5, albeit at a different scale. Also, the 5E had an open playtest and had a dialogue with players as well. And so despite what WOTC's marketing experts and maybe the focus groups told them,
now that we have that, we are no longer in the position where we think of D&D as an addition. It's just D&D.
The reception to their being very coy about and refusing to say the word new edition has been not so hot. And I have this extension to my Google Chrome that lets one see the dislikes on a video on YouTube, and it's quite a significant number. And contrasting to the reception to the video for Pathfinder announcing its new edition. Granted, it's a smaller, more niche audience, but still it's quite a substantial difference. And when Paizo announced a new edition, they called it a second edition that they were going to open a playtest for. And also they said that there were some weaknesses to the current design, that they were going to work on making play work from level 1 to level 20, work more smoothly, and also they had as a priority maintaining having the ability to make any character that you'd like, which was important to their players. So now, more on what an actual playtest looks like. There were some comments to my previous video disagreeing with my criticism of this not being a actual playtest so far. And I thought I could demonstrate my point better by looking at some past examples. So, first example, dndnext. This is what eventually became 5th edition was called. Even when 5e released, they didn't call it a new edition, by the way. I should address that 5th edition was starting from scratch. They were not prioritizing continuity with 4th edition. And still, though, the methodology of their playtest is what's relevant here. And let's not forget that for 6e, Wizards is already on record saying that they are looking into fundamental updates of the system. First, in their earliest statements about D&D Next, they made clear that they wanted to bring D&D to its core, whatever that was. Mike Mearls, one of the lead designers, said that they were playing through all of the major editions in D&D's history themselves in-house to find what were the most important things that they would retain. And they also talked about having a simple core system that would have modular components that tables could, and DMs especially, could graft on, something that did not survive in the later edition. But it made clear that they were pretty much open to anything and everything. So on May 12th, 2012, they released an initial set of documents that included a PDF, how to play. I'm actually linking the documents in the video description if you want to see the first playtest, and also another link linking to a file of all of the playtests packets that they released. But yeah, in this how to play document, they listed all the various actions that players could take in combat. They had a clear draft of how surprise would work in an encounter. They already had committed or were testing out having dexterity being added to a whole class of weapons and to damage from those weapons. They had draft rules for how checks generally would work and how critical hits would work. This is what you do when you're including your audience in your design of a system. You are presenting your overall goals, and you're presenting general rules before you start asking for feedback on specifics, so that those specifics can be understood in the context of a whole. They also had a pre-generated cleric, fighter, rogue, and wizard, and a bestiary with 32 classic monsters, so that people could play with these new rules and see whether they were balanced, challenging, and fun. They also had playtest groups go through the same adventure, and the designers themselves GM'd games or sat in on games, and they also received detailed reports. They were playtest groups that met at conventions and interacted directly with the designers. And I'm going to show some footage of Mike Mearls in August 2012 Gen Con GMing a playtest with players.
Yes, thank you.
That was a lot of fun.
It's funny because I ran this for my gang group, and I've run this twice here. The drop has never succeeded in ambushing. She always blows her dexterity check.
The next example is, of course, Pathfinder 2nd Edition, my preferred edition. And to make this example more credible to people who don't play it, I will actually share a Reddit post by a D&D player who, during the time when Tasha's Cadron of Everything came out, which was around November 2012, and there was a lot of anger and disappointment about specific things in it, this Redditor posted what they observed was different in how Wizards of the Coast approached Unearthed Arcana playtests and what Paizo had just done while playtesting 2 upcoming classes. So this person, Canehurst Crow, posts, "A lot of drama from UA to official release could be avoided if they just published what conclusions were reached with surveys, internal testing ahead of time." So having played this game a while and keeping up with the UAs back from Xanathar's to now, something that always bothered me was how much it feels like all feedback is sent into a void, and almost feels like it makes no impact compared to the conclusions WOTC seems to come to for design. Worse yet, WOTC seems to relegate all glimpses into their design mindset or outlook on classes to D&D Beyond video snippets, which aren't very satisfactory to learning much of anything that wasn't already known. The thing is, it doesn't need to be this way. They have this subreddit, or D&D Beyond video channel apparently, to make a long-form talk on class designs and conclusion from feedback. Not only that, but Mike Mearls did so with the Ranger once, and it was actually a non-toxic stream, as opposed to the tire fires that have been Tasha's changes. My perspective is biased a bit, I admit, but hear me out with this. So Paizo has Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and it does things differently from 5e. In a recent playtest, Secrets of Magic, 2 classes got released to test out the Magus, a dedicated Gish, and the Summoner, the Magic Pet class. The Magus had issues, major issues, that made it feel really janky and bad to play, and almost forced into a single crit fish playstyle to feel even close to good. The Summoner was really well received, but it also had issues from folks who wanted different things from it. All of that was bog standard internet complaints. We've all seen enough Ranger and Warlock and Sorcerer talks to know what it was like. But where things took a dramatic shift for me after being steeped in drama arguments here was this, and the poster links to an article put out by the 2 lead designers of the classes on Paizo's website, reporting on the playtest process, which I will link to in the video description. The Redditor continues. This is a blog post regarding the feedback to the classes. It has both lead designers who made the class in their own words talk about it. It talks about why features were the way they were, why things were made weaker or stronger, what they wanted to go for with overall feel, role, and playstyle for the classes, etc. And it acknowledged feedback, stating what they learned from the feedback, and even gave tentative plans for the new direction they'd take. We need these for UAs. This one aspect helped basically shut down the Magus complaint fest, because it showed what they thought going in versus what they learned coming out. Imagine if we had this for all of the UAs. Just a simple explanation from the dev's POV, and actually acknowledging the feedback would shut down all the straw man arguments, and I feel a lot of the raging that happens whenever a UA is inevitably nerfed. WOTC could learn a thing or two from its competitors, because people notice stuff like that and can ask stuff like, why don't you do that with your playtest? And I'll also include the top level comments to that post, which included that it would be nice if WOTC just posted the survey results. That would be nice. So we'll see what happens, and hopefully they do that in this process. But I want to point out a few more points about that article that the Redditor linked to. The first thing I want to say is that there is a follow-up post, and I don't know whether there's going to be an article or something addressing each survey for the current 1D&D design process, but that is something that would be great to have. And second, we clearly know who the individuals responsible for the design of X thing is. Logan Bonner was the lead designer for the Magus class, and Mark Seifter, the lead designer for the Summoner class. And on Paizo's forums, in the forums dedicated to these playtests, they posted relatively frequently during the playtest, the 3-week playtest window, interacting with people and making clear that they were listening. Having somebody known who is actually directly involved in the design, who is accessible, is a huge part of empowering players to participate in the design process. They know who can be held accountable. Next, in their article, they had a paragraph that was pretty transparent about one aspect that received a lot of criticism about the first draft of the Magus, their ability to combine a spell into their weapon strike called Striking Spell. And I'll just read it out because I think it shows transparency. It says, from Logan Bonner, making changes to Striking Spell won't be straightforward, and we still need to do a lot of experiments to find something that's fully satisfying. One of the major drivers for the playtest version was making it highly flexible to allow for using a wide variety of spells compared to, say, Eldritch Shot, a prestige class's ability that let you deliver a spell through an arrow, and let you use your stored spell with other abilities, like Flurry of Blows of a monk, or Power Attack of a martial class. Ultimately, these came at the expense of having a straightforward, solid special ability that was dependable. And it also meant that many paths to doing cool things required multiclassing, which leaves the class itself feeling lackluster. So, one, that's just, opening a window to their thought process and not claiming an infallibility, not claiming a perfection that they've achieved, which I would argue Chris Perkins' comments about 5th edition were in their announcement trailer. So these serve to contrast with what is happening so far with regard to 1D&D. I will say what I think what we're seeing is, but first want to show a little more what the current process looks like. So first I'll play a clip of Jeremy Crawford's interview on this first document on character origins.
With this first one, we thought, why not start at the start? And that is figuring out where your character in D&D, where did they come from?
No, you don't. You start with what people care most about, core mechanics and classes, for example. And you give us a vertical slice of, if not the whole system, of a subsystem. You identify a problem with the community and you figure out how to solve it and propose a solution. You identify a problem, you have a hypothesis, and you test it. And yes, that's what we learned in middle school with our science projects. We learned some version of the scientific method. And so a playtest could be, for example, level 1 character creation, where we work on a draft of how to generate ability scores and pick our classes and as well as our race and background. Or we can maybe address the problems of level 1 and level 2 play and have a focused play test on identified issues there. It's clear that they have some bigger changes in mind, fundamental updates they call them, but that the players are not being included in the thought process. We cannot evaluate these individual elements that they're presenting us without knowing the whole. For example, we can't know if various sub-races and backgrounds are balanced. So we have Ardlings. One of the sub-races of the Ardlings has Healing Word, which is considered at many tables an essential spell. But we can't really know whether that Ardling sub-race is comparable to the other ones without knowing how 6E might change Healing Word, which some people have complained about as making death too avoidable. We have a new rule that if a long rest is interrupted by a combat, no matter how short, that the player characters do not benefit from a long rest. And there's been a lot of outcry about the critical rules on online forums, but I've not seen much discussion on this. This has huge implications for the game. One of the things that 5e had in its going in was the assumption that a typical adventuring day would include 6 to 8 encounters. And a lot of DMs have chafed at that in actual play. They feel like they have to have 5 to 7 filler encounters before actually challenging their players, and that players often find resort to a long rest despite what the DM plans, because actual player characters who might die will take those opportunities to rest. And we have here a new rule that is going to vastly nerf that strategy used by players. And has huge implications, but right now there isn't an opportunity to have an above-board discussion on where we want to go. And that could interact with yet other rules. For example, the Wizard seems to be emphasizing much more that player characters' abilities are restored on a long rest instead of a short rest. So there's a whole reckoning that needs to happen. We are also shown under the incapacitated condition that there is a line for surprised. So is there a new system for determining surprise compared to what we have in 5th edition? We don't know yet. And then we have rules on D20 tests, which are causing the vast majority of arguments online right now, where monsters no longer have critical hits, and where player critical hits are double damage only on weapon damage dice, not spell attack damage, and not damage from sneak attack and smite. First, on monsters no longer having critical hits. Apparently, Jeremy Crawford is saying that this is to address the problem of low-level characters being instantly killed by critical hits. But that's not the only way to address that problem. And this has lots of implications and effects on the game that players may or may not like. And so people are speculating as to other possible reasons for this change. Maybe they are trying to make the math more predictable in an effort to balance the game. They haven't said that, and maybe they are, but we don't know. And maybe, and Jeremy Crawford is saying that crits are now being replaced with this idea of giving monsters abilities, more powerful abilities that will recharge upon rolling a natural 20. Back to my point, how do you evaluate the effect this has on the game without actually having stat blocks of monsters who have such abilities? Whatever feedback they're going to get on this new rule is going to be very superficial and not real feedback. And maybe this is a great idea. Maybe this is an improvement to the game, but it might die on the vine because they haven't actually given people an opportunity to playtest it. And on denying critical hit damage to spell attacks, maybe it's an effort to balance martials. That's been speculated online. But for rogues and paladins, which are pretty much martial classes, it's a nerf. So anyway, a lot of speculation, a lot of freaking out, and a lot of drama that would be solved if Wizards of the Coast were more transparent on what they're trying to do and had an actual playtest. So instead of an actual playtest, what we so far are seeing is a marketing test. They are testing the popularity of this and that in isolation. For example, looking at the reaction to Ardlings, thumbs up or thumbs down. Looking at the reaction to ability score increases, moving from races to backgrounds, thumbs up or thumbs down. It reminds me of the survey that they put out with regard to feats earlier this year, in which people were given the list of all of the feats in 5th edition and were asked to choose whether they were satisfied by it. There was a scale from very dissatisfied to very satisfied. And that doesn't tell the designers much. Why were they satisfied by the lucky feat, for example, which is considered overpowered by many players? For some respondents, they thought they were voting for the most satisfying feats in the game. And for others who are critical of some feats as being too powerful, they thought they were saying which feats design satisfied them the most. This kind of superficial dialogue with players to get quantitative data from surveys is not a substitute for an actual dialogue and being sharing your design goals with your players. And it leads to a piecemeal approach to design in which you cobble together what's popular and can lead to compromises as well in your design. While I just used 5th edition's playtest as an example of a playtest, I'm also critical of some of their approaches to the playtest. They had a survey, for example, that asked people what kind of the sweet spot was, what levels in D&D did they enjoy the most. And so what resulted is that we had a design that kind of wrote off levels 1 and 2 and the levels above level 10 as a result of that survey, in which there wasn't serious effort put in balance, in my opinion. And all that survey did was create positive reinforcement of a problem of the system that wasn't balanced from level 1 to 20. You're asking people what levels they're dissatisfied with, and therefore deciding not to work as much on those levels. Another way to put it is that there's a kind of vertical distance between the design team and the player base, where the design team clearly knows what problems they're trying to address with their decisions, and they have a set of alternate solutions to address those problems. And there's no direct dialogue between them and the players, with us knowing what they're trying to do and why, and talking about those various solutions. And meanwhile, they're getting notes passed to them from corporate saying, well, we need to have a new race to sell, or, we don't want to look like X system, or we want to passing things on to them and making the designers not follow their instincts, basically, too. And to the extent that there's feedback, it's kind of, instead of a direct dialogue, it's kind of, what are we going to collectively raise hell about? Or what can we upvote that's popular? So it's kind of, to use a metaphor, instead of sitting at a table with the designers, talking to them directly, or at a playtest table at a convention, which actually happened for 5e, we are wielding picket signs outside their meeting, and maybe we can raise hell and cause them to not do X, but we're not really being actually included on an equal level. Now to address some of the comments to my first video. Well, The main point of the video, as I said, was that players are customers and should expect more from Wizards of the Coast. And now that they're working on their next edition, this is the time to talk about what they think the game should be. So there was a whole lot of people agreeing with me in the comments and supporting that. And then there were other comments. And I'm going to kind of categorize those comments and ask you to kind of see what they have in common. Let's play a game. First, there was skepticism or hostility to me because I prefer Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And so discounting my opinion, which, just to quickly address that, I put out videos critical of parts of Pathfinder 2e. I don't limit myself to D&D. But also, sure, you should be absolutely critical of your sources and scan for potential bias, but that should also extend to people who are being paid a decent amount of money to sell you a product. Then there were people saying, you got this detail wrong, you got this rule wrong, aren't you a lawyer? Expressing hostility sometimes. And then there were people, and some of these people actually were saying they agree with me, who were were just very dismissive of Wizards of the Coast and cynical, saying, well, they're a corporation, what do you expect? They're just going to do what they're going to do. They've treated us like this for years. Then there's the attitude by others saying that I am being too negative. They do listen to feedback. You should fill out the survey and limit yourself to doing that and not put out this video. So what do these all have in common? They are all in their own way arguing against having a critical attitude and criticizing what Wizards of the Coast is doing with this new edition. They're all ways to justify acquiescence to how Wizards is designing the game. Meanwhile, there is a lot of simmering discontentment about how Wizards of the Coast has treated them and the quality of their product over the last several years that's been building up. They just released a campaign setting 3 books on Spelljammer, a campaign setting centered around flying ships in space and visiting other worlds. And there's been a lot of disappointment expressed online about how it lacks rules for ships. And Wizards of the Coast has rules for ships. They playtested a whole Unearthed Arcana about, well, ships in the sea. And Ghosts of Saltmarsh, one of the modules, has a whole section on ships, including ship-to-ship combat, action, a system where player characters can interact with a crew, can do special shipboard actions, and also rules for designing your own ships. And Spelljammer has none of these. And Spelljammer consists of 3 books that are 64 pages each, where one of those books is an adventure, another one is a bestiary, and the other one is on the campaign setting. 192 pages. Meanwhile, a few years ago, they released a campaign setting, Eberron, that was not set in space, but it had 320 pages. And they're charging more than twice as much for a Spelljammer. Wizards of the Coast has been complacent. In 2021, their revenue was $1.3 billion, which was a 42% increase over the previous year. And tabletop gaming alone comprised $952 million of those sales. Yes, a majority of that is Magic the Gathering, but a substantial portion of that is attributable to Dungeons & Dragons. Earlier this year, they purchased D&D Beyond for $147 million. Meanwhile, comparable statistics for Paizo, which makes Pathfinder 2e, I couldn't find. They're not a publicly traded company, but what I found put it at between their revenue being annually $5 to $50 million. And they release more products than Wizards of the Coast does for D&D. And WOTC's D&D division could put a lot more resources into its products than it currently does. In an article by Wired, they were reported to have 959 full-time employees, while Paizo has about 50. And in addition, Paizo, their employees just unionized, and hopefully Wizards employees will follow. But yes, D&D has the dominant share of the TTRPG market, which is served also by network externalities, which I went into in my Pathfinder advocacy video, which you should check out too. Basically, D&D's value is added by the fact that there are more people playing D&D. Wizards' advantages in the marketplace means that they can kind of get away with some drop in quality and still make huge profits. And for a stark contrast, I would refer you to a comparison of the beginner boxes of D&D and Pathfinder that was done by Icarus Games. And you'll see pretty quickly there's just a big gap in design quality and even just visual design between the two. And so D&D, or Wizards of the Coast, it's becoming increasingly clear that they feel they can put out less quality product than they could, and also kind of take customers for granted. Like that video, the announcement trailer arguably was a little condescending to players and not treating them honestly. Because they don't feel like people will move on to another system. And as I said in that Pathfinder advocacy video, one of the best things that can happen for D&D players is for Wizards of the Coast to feel like there is a serious threat that some percentage of their players will be fed up and move on to another tabletop system. A large amount of the content on YouTube for D&D has been suggestions on how to improve the game, on making combat more exciting, on making weapons more interesting, on making monsters more memorable, lots of house rules. Basically, a lot of the content is on how to fix D&D. Not everyone will agree on the same solutions, but there is a lot of agreement on, after years of experience, that players can probably come around to on some issues that come up in play, on some of the same issues that come up in play. So I'm basically just saying it's time to start speaking up and to be critical and put under a critical eye what Wizards of the Coast is doing. And it's time for players to speak up. This is the time. They are working on a new edition, and it's not yet a real playtest, and that can and should change. And players should not simply be consigned to answering surveys. They should also be asking questions to Wizards of the Coast, demanding that certain problems, holes in the design, problems for DMs be addressed now. And I just put out a video recently on defending Pathfinder 2E advocacy, and a thumbnail idea I almost had for this one was in defense of D&D advocacy, to defend the idea that players should be vocal and say what they think should happen in D&D, whether WOTC is asking for that answer or not. Now I'll address the most frequent comment criticizing my last video on what I said about backgrounds and ability scores. To reiterate what I said that there are two methods in the 1D&D document for having your background. One, to build your background according to the parameters given in the document, and two, to choose from a list. And what I suggested was that the listed backgrounds prompt the player to choose a +2 in an ability score, in addition to giving you +2 in the ability score, in the background itself, in one ability score. And these comments were saying, I clearly didn't understand the document. I didn't read it. There were some digs on me being a lawyer and not reading the document and understanding it, and saying, you can build your own background and you can modify the background that's listed. And first, I would say, I did say that there were two methods to build your background. These two ways of choosing your background, either build it yourself or choosing one of the pre-made ones, is an example of modular design that I spoke about earlier, of having a easier to jump into version that people can use next to a more labor-intensive version, shall we say, for those who are looking for that freedom and enjoy that making those kinds of decisions. And two, there is a reason for the list, and a good reason to have a list that Wizards of the Coast has here. A list that we all know that there are some players who prefer not to think too much in character creation and don't want to think about optimization and just think, I am a character and they did this thing for a living before becoming an adventurer, and my wizard was a hermit before, and so I choose hermit from the list, and that's that. It's a good thing that Wizards of the Coast presents an option to such players. And the problem that I identified and had a concrete solution for was that those players shouldn't be punished, have weaker spellcasting just because they prioritized their character concept over optimization considerations. What my solution does is it prompts those players to think about what is the key ability score for their class and to choose it. And it also has the advantage of not negating what the background offers for ability scores. For some players, it is desirable for their background from the list to actually give them something that may or may not be optimal for their character. Perhaps that player does not think wisdom is an important statistic, and for them to choose hermit, which gives them +2 in wisdom and prompts them to choose a +2 in intelligence as well for their wizard, they feel like that expresses their character concept and they're happy with it. And so this is a win-win for everybody. And these commenters, instead of responding to the suggestion I made to improve a rule that was in place, essentially said, well, you can ignore what's listed and modify it yourself. And for too long, Wizards of the Coast has gotten away with this idea that the rules that they put in place can simply be fixed by the players or ignored to some extent by players, when the rule has a clear and obvious way to improve it. There's a readiness to go after somebody with false allegations when that someone is criticizing a D&D document with the aim of improving D&D. And I understand a defensiveness, maybe a feeling like you have to defend your decision to play D&D, which was never under attack. And I can understand that. And I can understand, if I were criticizing a D&D book that you bought because you paid for it and you wouldn't want to feel like your money was wasted. But you're defending a free downloadable playtest, a draft rule set. And this is not rational. Wizards of the Coast is a giant corporation and doesn't need you to defend them. You're defending a corporation that is taking you for granted. And Wizards of the Coast is happy to make bank and continue to have you loyally buy the next Spelljammer or book that has a flawed rule that you don't use, that you defend because you don't have to use it. And if there were a time to criticize rules, it's during a playtest. And this is a playtest, right? So if it isn't clear already, if you leave comments on my videos that can be easily defeated, they may be answered and you may not feel good at the end of it. And I think it's important to hold people to a standard. So to conclude, it is time to advocate, speak up for what you think the next D&D should be, since it's clear that Wizards of the Coast is making a new edition that can break compatibility with 5th edition. And that means not simply answering the next survey, but asking questions to Wizards of the Coast. The Unearthed Arcana articles need to transform from being not simply a marketing test and PR campaign, but being an actual playtest. There needs to be no claim that D&D found perfection with 5e, and there needs to be an open reckoning of why 5th edition was as successful and is successful, and where are its weak points and how they can be fixed. And if Wizards of the Coast will not do that, then players will. And I am trying to participate in that process with this and future videos. And if you'd like to follow me as I do that, like and subscribe and ring the bell. So that's been me, Ronald, the rules lawyer, and I will see you next time. I've also GM'd D&D 5th edition, and with D&D going into its 6th edition,